The last couple of videos have been devoted to exploring the concept of gross domestic product, GDP. But is GDP all it's really cracked up to be? That's what we'll talk about in this set of videos. But first, let's do a little quick quiz, see what you remember from a previous video. Okay, so here's our multiple choice question. The largest sector in the Australian economy is A, the manufacturing sector, B, the mining sector, C, the agricultural sector, D, the banana sector, or E, the services sector. The correct answer to that question is the services sector. Approximately 70% of the total output produced in any given year in the Australian economy now is about 70%. In the 1940s and 30s and so on, the total output produced in the Australian economy was dominated predominantly by the agricultural sector. Australia used to ride on the sheep's back, but not anymore. We're done with that now. So we can ask the question about GDP, does it measure well-being? Because we quote GDP figures, gross domestic product figures, all the time. We talk about how much the economy has produced in any given year or in the last 6 months. Has production picked up? Has consumer expenditure risen? Blah, blah, blah. So is this really a good measure of human well-being anyway? Well, the answer to that is no, it's not a particularly good measure of human well-being. It's a convenient measure, and it's certainly not unrelated to human well-being. After all, if more goods and services are produced and sold and consumed in the economy, and consumption results in people living longer and happier lives in some sense, then that presumably is not a terrible thing. But surely it's not everything. And aren't there some drawbacks? Well, yes, there are. There are other important features of life that are not captured by GDP, or an increase in the production of goods and services can actually inhibit these additional these features of life which we regard as valuable. One thing GDP doesn't count is something that's essential to the functioning of any economy, and that is the production of non-market goods and services. That is, there are goods and services produced in the economy. Resources are devoted to their production, and yet they're not counted as part of GDP. They're invisible, so to speak. And the most obvious kind of production that's invisible is household or production that occurs within the home. So all of those meals, all of that cleaning, all of that child care that's provided within the home is not counted as part of GDP. If the people who did the housework, rather than doing the housework in their own home, each day left their house, went to their neighbour's house and did their housework and was paid for that. So everyone went next door and did the housework of the person next door and was paid for it, that would count as part of GDP. But the fact that they do it for free within their own home means that it doesn't count as part of GDP, despite the fact, we might say, that it is clearly production. It's just not production of goods and services bought and sold in a market. So GDP doesn't capture all the production that occurs within a year. GDP also doesn't capture other non-market activities that are regarded as charitable and hidden, even though they may play an important part in the society. So people who engage in voluntary activities, clubs and societies and charities and so on, none of that is counted. None of that work, quote unquote, is counted as part of GDP, even though they were obviously services. But they're services that are provided for free, and so they have no market value. So they're not counted as part of GDP. And yet we would say that they're important to well-being within the society. Leisure is also not counted as part of GDP, even though leisure obviously is an important part of human well-being. Indeed, if we could massively increase GDP, but at the cost of leisure. So if everyone worked a 20-hour day, you worked 20 hours non-stop, you slept for 4 hours, then worked for another 20, and so on, and everyone did that, day in, day out, then certainly output could be higher than previously, but everyone would undoubtedly also be miserable because they have no leisure time. Increasing GDP can also have detrimental side effects on our standard of living or our well-being due to the waste that's produced inadvertently when the goods and services we want are produced. That's a picture there of the world's largest garbage dump. Obviously, garbage dumps that large aren't necessarily beneficial to people's well-being. In fact, they're detrimental to them. And then there are questions related to population and also to questions of the distribution of the goods and services or the wealth that has been produced in a given year. So just looking at the amount produced in a given year doesn't tell you very much unless you compare it to the number of people who have to share in that wealth that's been produced. If you have $1 billion produced within the economy, that's fantastic if the entire population is only 10 people. It's a disaster if your population is 1 billion people, however. So it depends not just on how much has been produced, or the value of the goods produced, but how many people there are to distribute the goods to. And furthermore, how that distribution occurs, whether it's equal or not. So let's explore that idea of the GDP relative to population. Here, the measure that we're particularly interested in is GDP per capita. So if, hypothetically, everyone were given an equal share of real GDP being the output, how much would each person get? So we just take real GDP, the total amount of output produced, divided by the population, and we'll get GDP per capita, or the amount of goods and services, or the amount of value per person. Let's go to this website and see if we can find information about GDP per capita for Australia and maybe for some other countries as well. Okay, so here we are at the Indexmundi website. We want Oceania, that's where Australia is. There's Australia, and then we want economy. We can look down here for GDP per capita. And then it's got in here in brackets PPP. PPP refers to purchasing power parity. So this is GDP per capita expressed in US dollars. And this website and lots of other websites that have statistics about economies will usually express their monetary values in US dollars, simply because it can be a universal measure. You're measuring everything in terms of US dollars, so you can compare them easily. Otherwise, you can't make sense of things. So if you say GDP per capita for Australia measured in Australian dollars, and it turns out, say, if every person would get, say, 30,000 Australian dollars, and then you went to Indonesia and every person would get 60 billion rupiah, what does that mean? How do you compare them? Well, if we express both of them in US dollars, then we can compare them. Anyway, so GDP per capita. GDP per capita estimated for 2012, $43,300 per person. That's for every single person, including babies. So it's not working age people. We could look at it by map. Let's say. Alright, so there's the data for Australia. We can see that GDP per capita has been steadily rising since 1999. Steadily rising. Bit of a blip around here, 2007, 2008. But steadily rising. It's gone down a little bit here as well. But basically the trend is upwards. So the amount of output per person is increasing roughly each year in the case of Australia, which is pretty good. Might also have a comparative map. We compare different countries. You can see here, the United States, it's $49,000 per person. Australia, $40,000 per person, according to this map. Saudi Arabia, $24,500 per person. China, $8,500 per person. Russia, no information. Finland, 36,700. Sweden, 40. Norway, 54. Norway's doing well. Romania, 12,000. Anyway, yeah, you get the picture. Where does Australia fit in the league table rank chart? Okay, let's see if we can find Australia. There we are, Australia. So Australia is ranked 23rd on this table anyway. Is ranked 23rd richest country in the world per person, GDP per capita. See, number one is Liechtenstein. Liechtenstein is a tiny speck of a country in Europe. Qatar, again, a tiny country in the Middle East. Luxembourg, a tiny country in Europe. Bermuda, an island. Monaco, same story. Okay, see, Singapore, tiny island. Okay, so these ones are the wealthiest per person. I think Liechtenstein is a basically a tax haven. It doesn't have any industries apart from, I think, a bit of chocolate, cheese, and the rest is financial services. Okay, so GDP per capita gives you a better indicator of the relative size of an economy, that is, the size of an economy relative to its population, than just looking at GDP on its own. But that doesn't, GDP per capita doesn't tell you anything about the real distribution of output throughout an economy in a given year. For that, we need to look at the distribution of income from the production of goods and services. One rough indicator of the distribution of income is to look at how much the richest 10% of households get of the national income. Another better measure of the distribution of income is something called the Gini coefficient. Now, we'll look at that in we won't look at that here, but if you look in your textbook or if you look online, you'll find information about the Gini coefficient. For our purposes, the Gini coefficient simply is a number which represents or seeks to represent the distribution of income for an entire economy over all of the income brackets, not just the top 10% of households, but all of the households. The closer the Gini coefficient is to 0, the more equal the distribution of income. The closer the Gini coefficient is to 1, the more unequal the distribution of income is. Alright, so let's look at some countries with a very unequal distribution of income. This is for the richest 10% of households in Namibia. The richest 10% of households have 53% of the income, have half the income of the entire country. The richest 10% of households in Colombia have 45% of the total income of the country, and so on. You can go down the list. You see, we've got quite a few South American countries there. What about the most equal distributions of income? If we look at the top 10% of households, the richest 10% of households. Well, China is number one in income equality in that case. That's probably going to change over time. But the richest 10% have 15% of the national income. Azerbaijan, Switzerland, Romania, Slovakia, Japan. Actually, this is an interesting mixed bag of post-industrial and industrial economies. The order of most equal distribution of income, however, changes if we look not just at the richest 10% of households, but if we look at the distribution of income over all of the households. So you might say, in the case of China, that although the top 10% of households don't have a massive slice of income, what about the bottom 10%? It might be the case, and is the case, in China that the bottom 10% of households have virtually no income. So you could say that the distribution of income is still highly unequal, despite the fact that the richest people don't have a huge slice of the pie. The poorest have almost no slice of the pie. So let's look at the Gini coefficient and see how the order turns out. Well, when we use the distribution of income for the economy as a whole, the society as a whole, Sweden turns out to have the most equal distribution of income. Then Norway, Luxembourg, Czech Republic, Slovakia, All right. Where are China, Azerbaijan, and Switzerland? They're no longer on the list when we use the Gini coefficient, when we look at the distribution of income for the economy as a whole. Probably for reasons that I mentioned before, especially about China and Azerbaijan. I don't know about Switzerland. What about Australia? Where on the list is Australia, if we're looking at the Gini coefficient? Well, 25. So that's pretty good. Given that there's 200 and something countries in the world, coming in at 25 is certainly not disastrous. But it's certainly not the best by a long shot. In fact, if we compare Australia and the US, we would say we're a very equal society. This is looking at the richest 1% of households in Australia, that's in red, and the United States, that's in blue. And as you can see there, the richest 1% of households in Australia, it's approximately 7-ish, or started out in 1995 having about 7% of the national income. Now they have 10% or a bit more. But in the United States, these days, the richest 1% have started to move up to close to 20% of the national income. But so we're doing pretty good compared to the United States. But how are we doing compared to Sweden? Well, reasonably badly. So you can say compared to Sweden, the richest 1% of households in Sweden have just over 6% of the national income. So we're nowhere near as equal in our distribution as Sweden. Okay, let's have a little quick quiz, and then we can have a break. True or false? GDP is a good measure of social welfare. Well, I think we can agree after much deliberation and discussion that that statement is, generally speaking, false. It's not a good measure. It's not the worst we could come up with. Right? Smacking people in the head with sticks is probably a worse measure of social welfare. But this isn't a particularly good one. Australia has one of the most unequal distributions of income in the world. Well, we know that's just false. We're about 25 in the world, so we're well and truly in the top quarter of the most equal distributions of income. The US has the world's largest economy. You might have to check that one, because that'll depend on how you define an economy and how other economies are going now. I'll give you, that can be a little research task for yourself. You can ask Professor Google, who should be able to help out. But here, when we define an economy, you could define the European Union as a single economy. So you wouldn't compare the United States just to, say, Germany or France or Great Britain, but you can compare the US economy to the European economy, because it has a single currency, it has a single monetary policy, it has eliminated all the trade barriers within its borders, so it's governed by a set of regulations in Brussels over trade and health standards and so on. So you can say that the European Union constitutes a single economy. Now what you need to do is check what's the GDP for the European Union compared to the US. And I think you'll find they're pretty much neck and neck. Maybe the European Union is larger, or it might have taken a bit of a hit due to the problems that it's faced in the recent past, and it might be number 2 now. So have a look. The global financial crisis was engineered by a secret cabal of financiers to shape the world. Okay, that's obviously idiotic. And we know that that's idiotic because the secret cabal of financiers, 1, doesn't exist, and 2, even if did exist, it's not in the secret cabal's interests to bring about a global financial crisis, because the people most harmed by global financial crises are financiers.